Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I'm honored to be participating in a big group project to read all the novels of Toni Morrison in chronological order over the course of 2020. I'll link to the announcement video below. All are welcome, even if you just want to join us for one or two books. The group conversation on Voxer has been wonderful so far. I've especially enjoyed the fact that I'm reading these books along with my in-real-life friend, Anne, too. Last week we met at a wonderful cafe, Calabash Tea and Tonic, in Washington, D.C., where we both live. The tea shop is really lovely, has amazingly thoughtful staff behind the counter, serves an assortment of really interesting blends of both black teas and herbals, and is directly across the street from Howard University, where Toni Morrison went to college and where she taught for a bit. The two of us sat in a sunny window as we talked about the book and decided at the end of our conversation that we would come back to the same place next month for our conversation about Morrison's novel Sula. The Bluest Eye is a short but unbelievably powerful novel about African Americans living in the steel mill town of Lorain, Ohio, in the early 1940s. The main storyline traces the tragedy of young Pacola's experience over the course of a year, although one of Morrison's central goals is to explore the complicated contexts of all the characters with whom Pacola interacts. This young girl believes she's ugly, and that her ugliness is the source of the mistreatment and injustice she experiences. The title refers to her own desire to have blue eyes, in other words, to conform to white standards of beauty. She believes that if she has blue eyes, people will love her, people will protect her, just to keep those blue eyes from seeing the sadness and anger in their lives. Let me say up front that spoilers are really not an issue when it comes to this book. The major plot developments are laid out at the very beginning of the book, and the power of the novel really depends on us knowing that foreshadowing. I'll talk more in a minute about how that works, but for now I should say that if you're sure you plan to read The Bluest Eye sometime very soon, you might prefer to watch this video afterwards rather than in advance. In my discussion today, I want to talk about what Morrison is doing in this book, the things that help it work the way it does. As I've already said, it relies to some degree on readers already knowing what's going to happen. Because we know what tragedy is ahead plot-wise, we as readers are able to recognize the double meanings of some of the events that happen as we read. Let me give you an example. In the first few pages, we learn that young Pacola will become pregnant by her father, a man who is in jail near the start of the book, and that the baby will die. In a scene a little later in the first section of the book, Pacola begins to menstruate. She doesn't know what's happening, but her slightly older friend Frida explains, telling her she's now able to have a baby. She asks if it's true, and then asks how it could happen. Frida tells her that someone has to love her. She's quiet for a moment, and then asks, how do you get someone to love you? It's heartbreaking to know that when she asks these innocent questions, showing how little she knows about her changing body, she's wondering both what kind of love allows a woman to have a baby, perhaps, but also shows the reader that Pacola doesn't feel any love from anyone. It's that fact that is at the heart of the novel. The text at that point allows the story to stand just as that scary yet amazing moment of first menstruation, of that transformation of a girl into a woman, happens. But for the reader, it also underlines the tragedies that we, the readers, know are coming. Morrison's decision to structure the book by telling us right off the bat what's going to happen means she has something larger to show, something about how it happens and why, and something about the characters. I'll get into both of these issues in a minute, but I want to mention two other choices the author makes when structuring the novel. First, the chapters are organized by the seasons of the year, starting with autumn at the beginning of the novel and ending with summer. Some of the action of the novel occurs in those seasons as the year goes by, but much of the text is flashback, and the seasons are relatively unimportant to the narrative as a whole. Still, by emphasizing the wheel of the year, Morrison reminds us that everything is just going to circle around again and again in a continuing story. If you have more ideas about why Morrison might have made seasonal sections, I'd love to hear down in the comments below. Morrison uses another structural element that I found really interesting. On the first page of The Bluest Eye, she inserts a quote from a Dick and Jane story. For those of you who don't know, Dick and Jane was a series of reading primers taught in many schools, especially in the early and mid-20th century. I assume this section is Morrison's own writing, just imitating the style of Dick and Jane books, but I guess it might actually be a real excerpt. I'll read just a few lines. Here is the house. It is green and white. It has a red door. It is very pretty. Here is the family. Mother, father, Dick, and Jane live in the green and white house. They are happy. See Jane. She has a red dress. She wants to play. Who will play with Jane? Etc. The paragraph is repeated 2 more times. The first printing has large print and plenty of space between the lines. The second time, it's a smaller font and smaller spacing between the lines. Capitalization is gone, as is punctuation. And the third time, the lines completely run together with no space between them, and now there's no space between the separate words and sentences. What starts out as a white middle-class fantasy of happiness and comfort becomes something very different, something sinister. By the end, there is no room in that paragraph. Things have become frenetic, and all the air is sucked out, and we're left breathless when we're reading. It sets the tone for the novel of the danger of cultural reinforcement or insistence on that middle-class white fantasy, of how things are going to deteriorate into great confusion and tragedy in this book. As the novel goes on, it becomes clear that the Dick and Jane paragraph is also a blueprint for the plot of the book. We get the stories of the cat, the mother, the father, the dog, and finally the friend at the end. But like the frenzied telling of the Dick and Jane narrative, the story is one of desperation. After this introductory section, we get a first-person narration by a different young black girl, Claudia, who, with her older sister Frida, sort of becomes close to Piccola, the Jane character in The Bluest Eye. Claudia's view of the story pulls us in the way that first-person narration often does. As my friend Anne pointed out when we were talking about the novel, Claudia's young age gives her narration a kind of innocence that reminded both of us of Scout in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Readers get to understand something about the pain of the community without the narrator necessarily understanding it in quite the same way. Interestingly, Morrison doesn't stick to the first-person narration. The next section is a more omniscient narrator who tells us things that Claudia wouldn't know. And later in the book, we get a third kind of narration, one that left me with some questions. The chapter's in the third person, but they're fairly long passages from Piccola's mother's voice, presented in both italics and question marks. As I was reading, I wondered if her narration, these quotations, might be Pauline's testimony in a court or something she told a reporter that didn't turn out to be true. Anyone have thoughts on how Pauline's narration works within the framework of the chapter told in third person? It was interesting to have both perspectives at the same time, sort of, but I felt like there must be more reason for it than I was understanding. Finally, Morrison structures her novel around a whole series of doublings. Every story seems to be mirrored by some other story. I'll name a few, but there are many more in the text. First, Pacola's rape is mirrored by what happens to Frida. The two have different experiences to begin with, but they also respond in radically different ways personally, and they have very different kinds of support from their families and friends. We've seen sexual violence from Pacola's father when he was a young man, too. Something that started out as a mutual and respectful sexual interaction becomes, due to a threatening white gaze, an act of hatred and violence against his partner. All these scenes of sexual violence ricochet around each other, showing us both what's unique about each situation, but also how common the experience of violation is among girls and young women. Other echoes. Pauline and Pacola are both obsessed with white standards of beauty, something that Pauline passed on to her daughter, but which the culture at large strongly reinforced. We see two examples of light-skinned women who spend a lot of effort to maintain what they see as power because of their skin tone. Both young Maureen, an acquaintance of Pacola and Claudia's, as well as Geraldine. Then there's the parallel of the outcomes that befall both the cat and the dog, and the parallel between the blue-eyed black cat and Pacola's desire for blue eyes. Yet another parallel, Pauline's deep desire for a world of cleanliness and order, a fantasy world she hopes to find in the white people's house where she's a servant. And so Paul's Church's very different obsession with cleanliness and order. And then there's Choli's conflating of the story of touching his future wife's wounded foot and his desire to touch his daughter when he sees the sad girl scratch her leg. And lastly, the marigold seeds planted in black earth that never bear fruit, paralleling, as Morrison writes at the beginning of the book, Pacola's father dropping his seeds in his own plot of black dirt. Perhaps the most powerful part of this book for me was the way Morrison makes even the most disturbing characters and their most disturbing actions seem understandable and deeply human. Tragic experiences are passed down from parent to child, from elder to younger generation, and through it all, Morrison asks us to treat every single character as a human deserving our compassion, our empathy. An amazing book. An amazing debut book, no less. I can't wait to pick up Morrison's next book, Sula, also a reread for me after a break of more than 30 years. Thanks for joining me today. See you soon on Hannah's Books.